Hi there, folks. My name's Kev Johnson. I'm a senior systems engineer at Runecast Solutions, and you can get me at Kev Johnson on the Twitters. I'm here today to talk to you about keeping atop the tin and the problems that you're likely to have if you're running a vSphere enterprise environment. So, because I like to fly by the seat of my pants, this tweet came out earlier today. vSphere 7 Update 1 is now generally available. And so typically what's going to happen when that becomes available is Update 1 is usually when enterprises start considering, maybe what I want to do is I want to start thinking about upgrading to vSphere 7. But if you've got data centers like the folks at Google have here, I just like this image. I really like all of the blue in there. But yeah, if you've got massive environments, how do you validate that you're in a good position right now today for business as usual? And then how do you plan for the vSphere upgrade side of things? Now, as a little bit of background, before I joined Runecast, I worked for VMware. My job was literally to get people to upgrade off versions of vSphere that were going end of general support. So from that perspective, I had a lot of conversations in my time there. And the hardware was one of the really, really biggest problems that they came across. So in terms of the vSphere upgrade side of things, but also from a business as usual perspective, you have to validate yourself against the VMware Hardware Compatibility List. And, the VMware Hardware Compatibility List, there's lots and lots of data on there. You need to make sure that the servers that you're running have been tested by your OEMs and, the drivers that you're using, the firmware that you're using, everything has to be validated. Otherwise, there's a really big potential for problems. So we do this particularly when we start looking at I/O devices, and I/O devices are typically the most problematic when you start talking about, driver issues, firmware issues. We look at this vendor ID, the device ID, the sub-vendor ID, etc., and we have to make sure that those are all good for the release that we're going to be running. As we start talking about vSphere 7, we also lose this capability of using the VMK Linux drivers, VMK Linux having been deprecated some time ago. So we need to validate all of this. We need to make sure that if we're using VMK Linux drivers today, that there are native drivers available for the devices that we're using as we move into the future. And this is typically what happens if we go too far off the hardware compatibility list. You end up with purple screens of death. And a purple screen of death is a really bad place to be as a vSphere administrator because, in an ideal world, your vSphere clusters are all running the same hardware. They're all running the exact same firmware, the exact same drivers. So if one of those things is causing an issue with one of the hosts in your cluster, there's a real chance that it's going to cause issues with all of the hosts in your cluster. So we need to validate all of that stuff. We need to make sure we're removing all of that risk, and that is a lot of work. And really, this is just a cheap excuse for me to get a Simpsons meme into this presentation. But wouldn't it be better if there was something that could be easier? And to be honest, while I was working at VMware, they were working on this thing called vSphere Lifecycle Manager, and there's a hardware compatibility element to that. So it's good. It's a step in the right direction, but it's not perfect. And so what we see here is, firstly, you need to be running vSphere 7 in order to get the benefits. If you're still on 6.0 or 6.5 or 6.7, you can't use this until you've done the upgrade. And then secondly, we have problems like this. This is one of the hosts in my lab at home. So I checked the specific hardware, and it just says hardware compatibility checks are not supported for the current vendor model. Now, this is a Supermicro server. It's on the VMware Hardware Compatibility List. So if I check this specific device against Runecast Analyzer, what I see is something like this. And so we can see, oh yeah, great. Okay, the BIOS is good. The hardware is good. It's all supported on the HCL, but we have this problem with I/O devices here. So I'm going to have a look at the I/O device. And when I look at the I/O device, I can see, okay, it's a 10 gig card, but the problem is the firmware that it's running is not qualified. And I have actually had problems with the firmware on this, but I'm currently dealing with Supermicro support to be able to upgrade it without bricking my device. So, and just to prove, that this isn't me making things up about the hardware compatibility for some stuff not being in the vSphere 7 checks. Here's the exact VMware compatibility guide entry for this device. So it's an E309D. It's running that BIOS. It's qualified for vSphere 7. And we can check all of that from within Runecast Analyzer. So, just kind of giving you some ideas here. What some of the other benefits of Runecast Analyzer for this side of things is within vSphere 7, what you get, as I say, it's great, but if you're managing at scale, validating your hardware, if you're in a vSAN cluster, great. Okay, you can do that at a cluster. Well, if you're in a vSAN cluster that is managed by vSphere Lifecycle Manager, then you can do these checks at a cluster level. But if you've got 30 clusters and you've got 50 vCenter servers, that doesn't scale well. With Runecast Analyzer, we can do this across all of the vCenter servers that we can monitor in one fell swoop, and it's super, super quick. So we're pulling back all of that data. We can check everything. Every time there's a HCL update, we're going to be able to push this down into your appliance every week. We've got full reporting, so if you can see up in the top right corner there, we've got this export capability, so you can do an export of what you've got now, and then we can start looking at things like upgrade simulation. We're doing this full reporting, so we're showing you right down to the driver and the firmware level, where some of the tools might just tell you, okay, yeah, there's a problem with your driver, but maybe not validating the firmware level. So this is what Runecast Analyzer looks like as a product. And obviously, I'm here specifically to talk to you about the hardware compatibility side of things, but there's all kinds of other stuff in here. So in this test environment here, it's a super small environment. We've got 3 vCenter servers. We've got one running 6.5, one running 6.0, one running 6.7. I should probably get one added in to cover 7.0 as well at some point, but we're super busy, so it's all good that we've got this right now. And if we look maybe at this specific ESXi 6.5 host, what we can see is, okay, great, we've got the PowerEdge R730. I've racked and stacked many of them in my time as a consultant, just all of that stuff. They're great workhorses. And they go way back in terms of vSphere support. So we can see, for example, that, the processors are validated as well, because just because the server model is validated doesn't mean that every processor that's in there is going to be supported. We can see we've got 2 sockets populated, which is good, and we're validated for the release of ESXi that we're running, but we're running this Dell 280 BIOS. And the 280 BIOS, if we scroll down here, we can see is not listed in, it's not in our list of qualified BIOSes. And if we want to validate this online, easy. We've got a link for every single device that we do this for, and we can see, okay, it's the R730. We're validating it against ESXi 6.5. Here's all of the BIOSes that are validated by VMware. So, all of that, the validation actually gets done by Dell in the first instance, and then there'll be a second pass at validation by VMware. But this is your source of truth, basically. So we've got that. What we're going to want to do is downgrade that BIOS to something that's, that makes more sense, that has been validated, if we want to remove that risk from the environment. So we can do that. We can downgrade to one of these ones here. I/O devices, as I mentioned earlier, are typically where we do see lots more issues. So your purple screens of death, your flapping network interfaces, these are not things that you want happening within a vSphere environment. So if we look down here, we can see the H710P Mini. And again, we can see the H710P Mini, it's supported for ESXi 6.5, which is good because we shouldn't really have installed it otherwise. We can see it's running this LSI driver version 6910.20. And if we look down the list here, we can see, great, okay, this driver is supported. It's covered by the HCL. However, there's a requirement for the driver, for the firmware for that driver. The firmware must be version 21.3.4 or higher. That's the minimum supported firmware version. So we need to upgrade this one because it's running 21.2.5. Anyone who's running vSAN will also be very aware that the vSAN HCL is even more stringent than the I/O devices in the server's HCL. So the way we validate this is similar to with the I/O devices. We cover driver, we cover firmware, we cover actual hardware device as well. So we go down the list and we see, okay, well, this is the device ID. Great, that's in the HCL. We can see it's a Hewlett-Packard device. It's a SmartArray P244BR. Great stuff. That's all in the HCL. We're running ESXi 6.7 at this specific build. So update 1. Great, we're covered by that. And we're running all flash, and it's supported for all flash and hybrid. However, we can see we're running driver 2030. So we scroll down here. Again, we can see 2030. 2030 is listed as supported, it's tested, it's validated by HP, it's passed the checks by VMware, it's on the HCL. The firmware version 6.88 is also on that list. So 6.88 has been tested, has been validated by HPE, by VMware, and it passes muster. so it goes on the HCL. What we don't have is those two, that driver and firmware combination, in conjunction with each other. So because of that, it's not supported. And we would generally recommend, you've got two options here, really. Either you upgrade your driver, you keep the firmware the version that it's at, in which case, we need to upgrade the driver to 2044, at which point we're in a supported configuration. Alternatively, we could downgrade the firmware, but generally folks don't do that. The other alternative we have is we could upgrade both. So we could go up to 2044 and firmware 7.0. That would also be supported for this device for this release of ESXi.
The question I had is, we were told earlier that these kind of things are tested in your lab. So would you make that suggestion from Runecast to go ahead and get both of those versions of the drivers installed? Would that be the suggestion? And most importantly, would that suggestion have been tested in a lab?
So this test and validation from a hardware compatibility list perspective, it's done by the vendor in the first instance. So Dell or HP or whoever, they actually write the firmware, they write the drivers, they then test it on their hardware. So they will test it against the different BIOSes and the releases of vSphere that they run with. Dependent on what type of devices they're looking at, there's various different levels of testing and validation that then has to be done at the VMware side of things. So VMware will then, so IO devices for the IOVP program, those are also then validated by VMware as well. So HP and Dell will give them some hardware, they test it, it gets validated doubly in the labs there. We don't actually validate any of this stuff. This comes directly from the VMware Hardware Compatibility List. And stuff does get pulled off that HCL, believe me, I've seen it. It happened in my time at VMware. Yeah, so
that's why I'm asking the question, right?
Yeah. So we're a small organization. We obviously don't have the financial clout, the manpower, or any of that kind of stuff to be testing every single firmware and driver combination on every single server model out there. So we have to rely on the vendor's information for that. But yeah, it does get validated by people who have the qualifications to do these properly drill into those sort of things.
Thanks.
Oh, good. Thanks, Gina. I think, was it Ned had a question as well?
Yes, I do. Thanks, Kev.
Awesome.
So my question is in regards to actionability, because this is great, being able to get a vendor agnostic look at all of the HCLs, so you don't have to rely on some vendor tool that's only going to work on your Cisco servers or your HP. But having this information is the first step in a process of remediating. And I'm wondering, do you integrate with some of the existing tools like OneView from HPE or whatever the Dell equivalent is to remediate this stuff? Or is it just kind of like, well, here's the info, go find those drivers?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Ned. And cards on the table, that's not something we do. And I realistically, I don't think it's something we really want to get into doing either. There's functionality within vSphere. Again, once you get to vSphere 7, there's the whole lifecycle manager capability. So you can use that information then to decide, okay, this is what our desired state is going to be from a hardware and software perspective. And that can then leverage on the back end through the APIs for HPE and for Dell, and I believe now also for Fujitsu and Cisco with Update 1. So those tools, that tooling already exists for within the vSphere client. But what there isn't is kind of this ability to have this overall view for everything, in terms of what's going on across many, many vCenter servers, across thousands potentially of ESXi hosts.
Right. Once they're up to that Update 1, or I guess it's just vSphere 7, and have that lifecycle manager, are you planning to integrate with that in any way to kind of hand the baton off to do the upgrades? Or is that just kind of like a maybe next year roadmap kind of thing?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, I'm going to make a note of that one because I think that's a great idea. I have nothing that I can announce to you there, but I think that would be an awesome idea if we could do something like that. And clearly, Lifecycle Manager has been built with an API first model, so that there are great APIs in the product already. So that should be something that we could leverage. So the check's in the post, Ned. Thanks.
Sure, anytime.
One more thing to add into that one.
Sure. Hi, Chris.
Hello. Are there triggered actions? Or I know we were kind of discussing that, but are there triggers for sending emails or triggering other actions that we could like throw a PowerShell script into or something like that to help automate that moving forward?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple of things to bear in mind here. So firstly, in terms of actions, so in terms of reporting and stuff, we have got the capability to send emails, for example. In terms of triggering other things like PowerShell scripts, there's not something there right now. However, we do have a really comprehensive REST API. So if you had something that could, monitor, something like an event broker type thing, there's definitely scope in there for for integration with other tools to trigger other workflows. And yeah, there's a bunch of other stuff that we can probably talk about once we're off camera in terms of roadmap stuff. But as things stand at the moment, yeah, that's kind of where things are. Okay. I will just show you very quickly then, folks. So all of that is really useful information for business as usual. So, everything's running in your environment. We can see which versions of vSphere you're running. We can see that we've validated against those relevant versions. We can also export that data. So you've got reporting capabilities in there. But where this really comes into its own is where you need to start thinking about those upgrades. So what we can do is very, very simply, we can just say, okay, well, I see that ESXi 7 update 1 has gone general availability, but I did check the HCL just before we started. That's not been updated yet. But once that is updated, that will come into the product. So it's 7.0 at the moment is all we've got, but we hit simulate, and this is not a pre-recorded demo, by the way. That's how quick it is. So it will assess your entire environment against the updated HCL for vSphere 7. And again, we can see things like this Dell 271 BIOS, that was supported for 6.5 and 6.7. It's not supported for 7, but you don't have to throw that server in the trash. All you have to do is upgrade your BIOS. And yeah, okay, you have to upgrade your BIOS. And if we have a look here, it looks like, yeah, we also need to upgrade the firmware on a HBA. So, from a firmware perspective, we've got to go up to 23.1.4. We don't validate drivers as part of the upgrade process because when you go to vSphere 7, you need to have a native inbox driver anyway. So there should be a newer driver in there if the device is qualified on the HCL. And again, same thing. If I just pick a vSAN node, we can see here, this device here, it's running firmware 6.6.0, which was supported for vSAN, for vSphere 6.5 and 6.7, but it's not supported for vSphere 7. We need to go up to firmware 7.0. And if you remember, when I was looking at this earlier, firmware 7.0 is also supported for 6.7 update 3 as well. So, it just gives us a really good view of what's going on in the environment and also, what servers I'm going to have to potentially retire and move into a test dev lab or something like that.
I was just wondering, I don't know if you may have slightly covered it already, but obviously all this information is there for various versions. And once it has discovered all this information about hardware and what models are running on which server, then all that information is in. Now, say, for example, 3 months down the line, you find that a driver is misbehaving on certain kinds of hardware.
Yep.
Does that information automatically get flagged up, or those kind of articles that
Yeah.
Can you do a search?
Yeah. So typically, what's going to happen is if there is a known bad driver or a known bad firmware, then that goes through VMware's support lifecycle, and the KB will be created. And once the KB is created, we can notify you proactively on that because we're doing these configuration scans. Also, if that's happening, then what should happen is that driver should be removed from the hardware compatibility list. 99 times out of 100 that happens, but again, it's not our HCL that we control. So there have been issues where there's been bad drivers, and I'm thinking particularly from a vSAN perspective, where that driver has been on the HCL for quite some time after that KB has been pulled. But we would still, because there's a KB, we would still flag this as you're running this driver or this firmware, and it's known to cause these issues. So, we're going to show you that data when we've got the information.
So it will automatically flag that kind of thing, so without you be doing a proactive scan.
Absolutely, yeah. So because we pull that information as part of our scheduled scans, so we scan once a day, or however often you want to. But once we see that information, we can correlate that against the KB, and we can alert you based on that.
Sorry, is any of this data saved not on site, but saved in the Runecast cloud? so that
so
there could.
Yeah, sorry, I'll let you finish your question because I think I know where you're going, but I don't want to cut you off.
Well, it would be nice to see some. I'm thinking of Infosight, and Infosight stores data, not specific to the customer's data sets, but more towards along the lines of equipment and infrastructural information, and in that way they can be even more proactive. Again, of course, it's primarily just HPE gear, but in that case, they can be proactive when they see a trend from Joe Blow's company and Fargo that you might be vulnerable to as well.
Yeah. So from that perspective, there is no Runecast cloud. Each appliance operates on its own. It sends no data back to Runecast as an organization. The cloud component is the AI, and it's the bit that passes all of that data and it pushes it down, and it builds the rules which then get deployed onto the appliances. So there is no data that gets sent out from Runecast. With that said, we recently introduced support for best practices for pure storage. There's potentially other things may happen. Stan spoke earlier about the idea of having Runecast for everything, and that's very much the kind of where we see ourselves going. Rather than just being specifically about vSphere, we want to be about whatever we need, whatever you need the information for. We've got this patented rules engine now, and we want to kind of work with you and with vendors to help get all of that, so that you can leverage that rules engine to scan your environment proactively and remove the risk. And I guess, yeah, the other aspect of that is, Infosight is obviously HPE's offering. Pure Storage have got Pure One. Each vendor seems to have their own specific, because I think Infosight was an awesome thing. It was as far as I could tell, it's why Nimble were acquired. So from that perspective, the storage was great, but Infosight was the secret sauce, really. So who knows? Maybe at some point there will be vendors like HPE and Pure Storage and who knows who else leveraging Runecast as a back end for that kind of data.